All right, Beth, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me, and so great to see all of you. So many familiar names and faces.
It is a pleasure to have you. Before we get to your thoughts on strategies and tactics, I wonder if you'd be willing to share something of how you came to the movement, what drove you to it, and what accounts for your tremendous passion for the subject, which all of us who know you see so clearly. And in that regard, let me share with you the fact that yesterday I found an article that someone wrote in the foreword 10 years ago, someone named Beth Miller.
Oh boy.
A Chicago native, 2 years out of McAllister College in Minnesota.
Wow,
Wrote an
yeah,
article
okay.
in the foreword after working 18 months in an unnamed human rights organization in the West Bank. It was simply titled "Being a Jew in Palestine." And it explained her religious Muslim friends' welcoming response when she got up the courage to tell them she was Jewish. They said they knew the difference between a Jew and an IDF soldier, and that she should spend some time going to see the Jewish religious sites in Jerusalem. This Beth Miller spoke Arabic and revealed her feelings walking in Hebron past the boarded up stores shut down by the 4,000 IDF soldiers protecting 500 Israeli settlers at the time. And where there was a sign in Hebrew and English noting that the Hebron area had been, quote, liberated, unquote, from the Arabs. So I'm assuming that's you.
That was me a really long time ago.
Yes, it seems like that.
Quite something to be presented with something you wrote a decade ago, yeah.
Well, it's a great little piece, but I realized in reading it that, you know, I mean I've known you for a number of years and really didn't know much about your background. So why don't you tell us a little bit about you know, what kind of Jewish training you had? Were you ever a Zionist? Did you make a transformation? So something you know, just to give us a little sense of how you got into the movement and why.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again, Bob, for inviting me to be here, and ICAHD-USA for holding these events. I'm really honored to get to talk with you all today about an issue that is near and dear to my heart, which is being part of the Palestinian liberation movement and finding ways to make the US government be less horrible than it is on the topic. So yeah, I can definitely start by sharing a little bit about kind of how I came to be involved in this. It's not really being involved in this work, right? It's how this movement came to be such a big part of who I am and why I will always be an activist in it and organizing as part of it. Yeah, I mean, so the thing that I think is really key to this and kind of how I came to be a part of this all is that I was lucky enough to grow up in a family and in a Jewish community, or rather a Jewish family that was very, very focused on justice and freedom and showing up for other people, and that was the way that we expressed our Judaism. Israel was not the center of the topic of conversation. In fact, it was kind of always in the background. I grew up in a Reconstructionist synagogue, and it was always there and part of the conversation, but it was not something that was a huge part of my life growing up. But what was a really huge part of my life were the incredible family influences that I had. You know, one kind of anecdote that I always come back to and think about is when I was a kid, my grandfather, Marvin Miller, used to stop us when we were going to enter his house, like we were going to visit. He would be like, wait. And then he would be like, well, this is when we were really young. He would say, like, what's the most important word in the English language? And the answer he was looking for was the word freedom. And if we said freedom, then we were given Hershey chocolate kisses. And then if we didn't say freedom, then we got a lecture about how freedom was the most important thing. And, you know, it speaks a little bit to the environment I was lucky enough to grow up in. He and I never got to talk about Palestine much before he passed away. And so I don't know what he would have thought of JVP. And I think that, you know, Israel, again, was not the center of the topic of conversations when we were talking about freedom and justice. He was speaking in a much more domestic context, but that was the family and the community that I grew up in. And I think that that drives a lot of kind of how I view the world. And again, growing up in a Reconstructionist Jewish world, I was always taught Judaism is performed by questioning everything to an annoying extent. And really kind of digging into where the fights for justice are and how you can plug into them and be a part of them. In college is when I started to really learn more and more about like what is happening right now in Palestine. And I remember having this slow process of just kind of like, oh my God, I was lied to. Oh my goodness gracious, I have been misinformed. And it was kind of just I mean, it was like the writing was on the wall at that point, because there's really nothing quite like realizing that something you thought you knew is not in fact what is happening. True for so many of those of us who grew up in Jewish institutional communities in this country. I ended up studying Arabic in college and studied abroad in Jordan. And the year I studied abroad was, I went to Jordan in January of 2009, which was right after Operation Cast Lead, which some of you all might remember, which was a horrific, brutal, violent Israeli military assault on Gaza. And so I went to Jordan in the weeks following that and was surrounded by Palestinian refugees who'd been forced from their homes in either 1948 or 1967, or they were descendants of people who were Palestinian refugees. And I was hearing an entirely fresh, new, different perspective from what I had heard before on what was happening. And I was seeing news coverage that was different than what we were getting in the US. And I was just learning so much more. And again, writing was on the wall. I was just like, there's more happening here than what I was aware of. And was decided that I wanted to spend time working in Palestine, living in Palestine, and showing up for Palestinian rights in whatever way I decided it made sense for me to do. And so after college, I moved to Palestine and lived there for about a year and a half in 2011 and 2012. At the time, I interned for Defense for Children International Palestine, as well as a few other groups. And just as so many of us know, if you've grown up in the US and then you visit Palestine for the first time, you are just overcome by how misinformed you have been, right? And overcome by how bad the perception is in the US and how untrue the perception is in the US of what's happening. So it took a while, I think, for me to figure out like what my angle would be in this, right? Like what was my role as a Jewish American kid at the time? What was my like theory of change, right? Like, how did I want to participate in this? Was it like, for a little while, I was like, maybe I should work for the UN. And I was like, no, that's not it. Like, and trying to figure that out. And it took me a few years and eventually got to the point of like, okay, well, my obligation lies where like the greatest like negative impact of who I am is showing up. And that's in US government. Like, not only is this stuff happening in my name because the Israeli government is doing it in my name, but it's also happening in my name as an American because the US government is funding this and complicit in this and saying that they're doing it because Americans want them to do it and it's in our best interest, and that American Jews want them to do it because it's in our best interest. So ended up getting me to the point of being like, okay, Congress, that's where I have an obligation to be working and focusing. And that's kind of the long route to where we are today.
All right. So, you know, today you're managing the political action arm of a large and growing grassroots organization, JVP, which is now in its mid-20s and starting to take its place as I think one of the largest and most influential organizations in the country devoted to Palestinian liberation and solidarity and anti-Zionism and the BDS movement. And I've heard you say the JVP Action started work in 2019 2020 election cycle. I think it was the first cycle in which you were active. And that you started it then, you collectively, because you all thought the moment was right, that you could start to elect people to public office who were or could be Palestinian rights advocates who supported your views. 3 years later, in 2022, do you think you accurately gauged the moment, or were you a bit premature?
Ooh, good question. I think we accurately gauged the moment. And I am not just saying that. I will say why.
Yeah.
I'll start by saying that, you know, JVP was involved in congressional organizing for years before as well, right? Via our grassroots base. I'm looking at names on this call right now and I'm like, yep, you all were involved. You all were involved. We were doing congressional organizing in the sense that we were bringing our massive base of members to Congress to say, hold on, we need to fix what's going on here in one way or another. And we've been working closely with movement partners who've been doing that as well. But in 2019 is when we decided that we wanted to be able to do more and do that more directly, more concretely. And the best way to do that was to launch JVP Action as the political and advocacy arm. But the reason that 2019 was the right moment, if we think back to 2019, which I don't know about you all, feels like it was a lifetime ago now. The difference between 2019 and now is vast and overwhelming. 2019 was the year after the 2018 midterms. So we were halfway through basically Trump's presidency. And we just seen the election of people like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar to Congress. And again, it feels like it was a while ago now, but if you can remember how that felt to see Rashida Tlaib get sworn into office, that was a powerful moment for so many people in the movement, Palestinian Americans in particular.
As the first Palestinian American, you mean, too?
Or not as she wasn't actually the first Palestinian American, but as one of the first Palestinian Americans and the first Palestinian American who was speaking out on Palestinian rights issues specifically. And I think that, you know, that combined with the fact that we were at a point of kind of inflection where poll after poll after poll was showing what so many of us on this call already knew to be true years before, which was that like the numbers of people in this country who are increasingly demanding more action from the US government to end complicity and hold the Israeli government accountable just keeps going up and up and up and up and up, right? The river flows in one direction. That the people keep moving left on this issue. They're not flowing to the right on this issue because the more people know and learn, the more likely they are to understand and see the dynamics of what's actually happening. And so it was clear that that meant that we had more and more base of power to shift the political calculus and force Congress to take more action. And there's a limit to how much you can do that if you're not really putting the time and effort into making sure that you have the short, medium, and long-term strategy, right? Like JVP Action is pushing for an end to US military funding, right? Congressional advocacy and organizing is not actually how we fix everything. It's one tool in our toolbox. It's one tactic of many tactics that this movement needs in order to be able to move forward and actually reach a point where we are following this Palestinian-led movement for liberation and Palestinians are truly living in freedom and justice. The congressional advocacy part of that is like one piece of how we break down the harm that the US government is actively doing to help us get there. And I think 2018, 2019 was the moment where we were like, we got to dive in. Like we have to like really sharpen this tool and get really good and strong so that we can, if we're not spending our time showing Congress that there is political reward to being supportive of Palestinian rights and creating that political calculus for them, then we're never actually going to get to the point where we can end this $3.8 billion.
Okay. So you mentioned that that seems to be a long time ago and that, you know, the perceptions that you had then, how have they changed?
I think that it's not that our perceptions have changed per se, but just a lot has happened, right? And I think that one thing that we often see, and this is not unique to Palestinian rights organizing, this is true for every movement that does the movement organizing work, is that there are days where like things move as though years had passed, right? Like there are like moments in time where this work speeds up a lot and then it slows down for months. And I bet a lot of you on this call who follow this closely like have felt that. And so if we just look at the last year alone, we can see the ways in which like this work speeds up and like a lot will happen very, very quickly and we will make great gains very quickly. And then the backlash comes. And that happens every time, right? Like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And the thing that I always say and feel, and the thing that I think my perception has become strengthened in as we have like continued to dive deeper and deeper into this work, is my understanding that like that will always happen. But what's important is that every time we are showing up with more people, right? That it's not that we're just like coming back and asking the same thing over and over and over again and getting knocked back over and over and over again. We have to always be pushing this conversation forward. So we take 2 steps forward and then the backlash comes and we're like, whoa, when we get knocked back a little bit. And then the next time we come, we have more people with us. Because of what we did last time, we've got more people. We show up with more people and move forward again. The backlash will come again, but we have more people to withstand it. And then we move forward. And like, that's just like the inevitable flow to how we keep speeding up this work, because it is urgent that we push faster and faster and faster.
All right, so give me an idea of what you were thinking in more concrete terms in the last year. You said it was really speeding up, in progress, and then the backlash. What are you thinking of?
I can give an exact example of what I was thinking of when I said that. So if we can all rewind to May of 2021, the Israeli military is threatening forced expulsions of Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah, and it's being covered widely, unusually widely in the media and getting way more attention than usual. Then the Israeli military is attacking Palestinian worshipers at Al-Aqsa. The Israeli military is bombing Palestinian families in Gaza. And there is a swell of attention being paid to Israeli violence and ongoing ethnic cleansing against Palestinians in a way that is different than often happens. In Congress, because of all the work and organizing and activism that happened in the movement, Congress's phones were ringing off the hook. What are you going to do for Palestine? What are you doing for Palestinian rights? Do something, do something, do something. And this was being forced higher and higher up on their priority list. And I'll just make a note, when I say forced, I mean forced. Congress does not do things out of the good of their heart. They do things because people demand and force them to reckon with something. And so what happened was that we had things that had not happened before take place. One example is, you all might recall that there was an evening where the Congressional Progressive Caucus held a special order hour where members of the CPC spoke on the floor about Palestinian rights and about why the Israeli military assault of Gaza was horrible and horrific. And we saw incredibly powerful, Rashida Tlaib spoke beautifully, AOC spoke beautifully, like really powerful statements that we had not heard happen on the floor of the House before, let alone amid an assault on Gaza. And then what came from next is that, again, you might remember, news broke amid this assault that the Biden administration was going to approve a $735 million Boeing bomb sale to the Israeli government while this was all happening. And 15 members of Congress and 1 senator, Bernie Sanders, introduced a joint resolution of disapproval to say, we don't want you to push forward this bomb sale. This can't happen right now. It shouldn't happen, and it definitely can't happen right now. That was historic, that progressives in Congress would, amidst this kind of centering of Palestine in the news, take advantage of that moment and say, no bombs for Israel right now, that we can't do that. Absolutely not. We're going to speak on House floor about it, and we're going to push for it. The bomb sale still went through. It still happened. There were still more members of Congress unquestioningly supporting Israel's brutal assault on Gaza than there were speaking up against it. Like, don't get it twisted. The road is long, and the power is still wildly not weighted evenly on where things land in Congress. Like, let's be clear on that. But our numbers are growing. We are working from nothing, and we are building from that nothing in terms of who we have in Congress. And those numbers are steadily increasing and growing. And getting 15 House reps and a senator to demand a stop on a bomb sale amid an assault on Gaza is historic. Okay, then we see the summer happen, and more members of Congress started co-sponsoring the Palestinian Children and Families Act, Betty McCollum's bill, to restrict funding to ensure that we aren't paying for other types of human rights violations against Palestinians. All of those things happened between May and, let's say, like August, early September, because there was such an overwhelming centering of what was happening in the media and demands from constituents and polling showing that this was the kind of action Americans wanted to see. And because on the other side of it, you had progressives who were ready and willing to hear it and start moving on it in a way that was new and different because of who joined Congress and who has been in Congress for a while, but now had a stronger voice because there were greater numbers, right? But then we hit the fall, and I don't know how many of you remember this, but anti-Palestinian groups were like, we need to do a little flex right now. We're going to get $1 billion more for Israel and for the Israeli military. And the House famously passed an extra $1 billion for the Iron Dome. That's an example of what I would call backlash. And we don't all think of it as backlash because we kind of think of it as like an inevitable, like the Israeli military asked for this, so the Israeli government stamped it, or sorry, so the Israeli government asked for it, so the US government like wanted to make it happen immediately. And that's true, right? It may very well have happened. But there's a zoom out look at this, which is that the groups that do anti-Palestinian lobbying on the Hill were feeling threatened by the overwhelming surge of support that had been coming from the grassroots and from voters in this country over the summer, and wanted to show strength and make clear that, don't get it wrong, the US government will still do whatever is needed or wanted to support the Israeli military. And that's where the US government's loyalties lie. And that's what the US government supports. And that's, I think, an example of backlash that came hard and fast. And so those are kind of some of the things that happened just over the last year to show that kind of ebb and flow, I think.
Well, especially too, the way it happened, first stripping out the billion from the continuing resolution, and then the standalone vote, which ended up to be like 420 to 9. And you know, some of the allies,
yeah, that's right,
took a pass.
Yep.
Even AOC, I think, voted present. As opposed to no. And people like Jamal Bowman here and Mandir
voted yes. Betty McCollum voted yes. Yeah. Mark Pocan voted yes. We absolutely, and it's an important point, right? Like, that's the congressional organizing. It's horrible. Right. Because you're not actually it's rare that you get members of Congress who are gonna consistently and always be doing what you want them to do. And again, that's because that means that we as organizers and activists, our job is never done here. We can't just sit back and think, great, done, they got it now, they're gonna keep doing the right thing. Not to say we were pushing incredibly hard for everyone to vote no on that, but it also speaks to the fact that, like, when that happens, JVP Action had all of our people going to all those folks and being like, why did you do that? There's like an accountability mechanism. They need to hear from us as well when they do those horrible votes and they vote yes on something they should have voted yes on, or they don't vote no on something they should have voted no on, or vice versa. And so this is never, it's not, I think that this is kind of an example of what I mean, right? Is that, like, these things don't move in a straight forward facing line.
Linear. Yeah, right, in a linear.
They're often like this because US politics is part of a broken, twisted system. And it's our job as organizers and activists, well, it shouldn't have to be our job, but it is, to constantly be forcing members of Congress to hear the movement demands, right? This is what we need. This is what we want. There's reward when you do it right. There is accountability when you do it wrong. This is da da da, and that's how we keep pushing it forward over time.
All right, so let me ask you about some of the strategies and tactics. You mentioned that you had some short-term ones, some long-term ones. How do you see where we are, and what are the most important strategies and tactics that you are using, or trying to use, both in the legislative branch and in the administration? Well, let's take either one first, whichever one you want to take first.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mentioned before, we're trying to end military funding to the Israeli government. We don't believe that we should be sending US military funding to an apartheid regime. Full stop. Okay. That bill is not going to get introduced tomorrow. It is just not the reality of that is just not, it's just not going to happen, right? So how do we build toward it? How do we make sure that every push we are making in Congress, even if it's not that final, that goal, how is it moving us in the right direction toward that goal? So there's a couple of things that we tend to look as kind of like loosely, what are we looking for, what we're pushing forward on things. And there are two things that I think are most critical for us to examine when we're looking at what we want, are pushing for, are supporting, or not supporting. One of them is that we need legislative vehicles that center people, and that center Palestinians, and that center human rights. Shouldn't be a radical thing to suggest, but it is. It's at the core of the progressive movement, right? Or it should be at the core of the progressive movement, which is the people closest to the pain should be closest to the power. We should be centering the voices of directly impacted people. The people who are most directly impacted by US policy toward Israel are Palestinians. They're the ones who are feeling the brunt of that $3.8 billion we send every year. And so we should be centering conversations about human rights and about Palestinians in those vehicles. So what that means in practice is that, for example, when we support something like the Palestinian Children and Families Act, if you read through it, what is covered in that bill is a documentation of what is happening on the ground to Palestinians. It's saying, and it's an education vehicle and an advocacy vehicle and an opportunity to show the reality of life for Palestinians living under Israeli apartheid. Second is that we be pushing for vehicles that tangibly and concretely enact or lay out steps to enact actual accountability mechanisms. What we see time and time and time again from Democrats in particular, and Republicans, but honestly, Republicans don't even pay this lip service sometimes, but from Democrats in particular, is we're concerned, right? An entire Dear Colleague letter will be organized to the Biden administration to say, we're concerned. We're really worried that Netanyahu might annex the West Bank. That really concerns us. Or we're really concerned that these people's homes might be demolished, and we want to let you know we're concerned. What are you going to do about it? That's not accountability. That's not what accountability looks like. We want things that say, this is a violation of international law. It is unacceptable for X, Y, and Z reasons, and here is what we're going to do about it. Here's what needs to happen for it. One example is that there was recently a Dear Colleague letter led by Congresswoman Cori Bush that was supported by over 60 civil society organizations that referred to what's happening in Masaf Yatta as a war crime, and specifically said that this was written before the demolition started. It was between the Israeli High Court ruling and the demolitions kicking off. If this moves forward, we should be monitoring and documenting which Israeli military units are carrying out these forced expulsions, and if they're using US military equipment to do so that we can appropriately enact and implement the Arms Export and Control Act and the Leahy Law, which say that our equipment shouldn't be used that way, and that military units that carry out these kind of gross violations of human rights aren't getting our aid and our funding. Okay, that's an example of a demand and a pathway toward how we actually are holding people accountable. Then we also, however, get to the hard part, which is making that happen. And that's the part that we don't have the power in Congress to do yet, is the truth. That's the reality, right? Like, we don't have people in Democratic leadership who can call a vote and like would call a vote around something like that. And the reality is that we have a State Department that won't really implement the Leahy Law and the Arms Export Control Act in the way that it should be implemented. However, the short-term plan is to keep building that power amongst progressives in Congress. And we build that power by building the political calculus for them and growing our movement and increasingly bringing our movement voice to Congress to give them that, show them that that is what people are demanding, so that more and more and more and more and more progressive political leaders and beyond progressive political leaders are publicly speaking out about this, demanding it, increasing the pressure, so that eventually we can get to the point where we actually have our people in positions of power so that they can actually be enacting this change. But I will just say in the meantime that it connects to the second part of your question, Bob, around the Biden administration, which is that the Biden administration also has to respond to pressure from what the Democratic Party is demanding and calling for. It's a constant give and take there, that relationship and that dynamic. And so again, looking back at May of 2021, there was this fascinating thing that happened where there was coverage in several mainstream media outlets that portrayed it as the first moment of the split in the Democratic Party, where the progressive left was publicly saying that the Biden administration wasn't doing enough on something. This was again May of 2021, it was a while back now. And it had an impact, right? Progressives in Congress and beyond progressives in Congress started calling for a ceasefire. And again, that was not where everyone's demands were, but that was what the call came out, or saying that the Biden administration should be doing more to try to move in that direction. And that was not originally Biden's position. And I would argue that part of the calculus that they had to make was that there were members of his own party who were increasingly demanding and calling for it, not to mention what Democratic voters were calling for as well. And so these things do have immediate impacts as well. There is a reality that the louder lawmakers in Congress are about something, and the more we can show that we are watching and willing to take action on something, the more we can at the very least do immediate like stopping of what the Israeli government is trying to do, right? And so like those are some of the short-term things, but they all have to be in service of like a longer push for accountability and escalating the demands on Congress of what we are pushing for.
Okay, and that sort of leads into the electoral strategies that you know, that you're following in order to, you know, build slowly, I guess, because the power balance is overwhelming, but to build more of a component of Palestinian supporters in the Congress. But before I ask you about that, you know, you mentioned Cori Bush's letter and calling some of the actions of the Israeli government war crimes. It seems to me, and I've heard you mention a couple of times today Israeli apartheid, and that phrase is becoming a more significant and more common part of the vocabulary that we're using. But it seems to me, I've expressed this before in some previous webinars, it seems to me that in the last 18 months, this confluence of reports that carefully research and document what's going on over there constitutes the international crime of apartheid is an enormously powerful, not just organizing technique, but an advocacy frame that gives us a sort of an immediate power that none of the other frames have. We've been talking about human rights for decades, Palestinian human rights. We've been talking about settled colonialism for not quite as long as that, but long enough. But you know, apartheid packs a wallop. And so I guess before we get to the electoral strategy, tell me what you think and what JVP Action and some of the other solidarity and liberation organizations are doing to make apartheid front and center. Because, for example, I don't hear reference to the Geneva Convention, the Rome Statute, the General Assembly's Convention on Apartheid, which are the three bases for the legal argument of why the facts on the ground there constitute apartheid. So I can't tell how much of that case is being made, both in the Congress and the executive branch. Maybe you could fill us in.
I think that the Human Rights Watch report, the Amnesty International report, the fact that they are saying what Palestinians have been saying for decades, and the fact that they are saying what even Israeli human rights organizations were starting to say before them, it is massive. It's massive. And we talk about it all the time in Congress. Like when we're having meetings with folks, when we're talking with folks, when we're when our members are talking with offices, it's constantly, right? It's everywhere, like Israeli apartheid as reported by, like it's sourced, it's all in there. I think there's a question, and I'm not gonna have an answer for you, Bob, of like, we should do this on that. I think that the truth is, you're a lawyer, so you're coming to it from like the legal framework, right? Like the legal framework of what apartheid means is so key because it does come with legal consequences, which is like critical. And that's why it's such a key framework to bring to it. In reality, I think when we're doing advocacy in Congress and when we're talking about what they're pushing for, and when we're talking about what members of Congress care about and respond to, which sadly is not often international law, those frameworks don't necessarily cancel each other out. Like the human rights framework and the apartheid framework aren't like you use one or the other. You know what I mean? I would say you use them both. You use them all, right? You go in and you talk about the fact that like what apartheid means is all of these violations of human rights, all of these things that you and your values are or should be in opposition to. And so I think that it's not necessarily that like anything, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that those reports were huge in that they back up and validate and should be an on-ramp for more people to talk about and know and name what is happening. But they don't radically change what advocacy and solidarity groups have already been doing and saying for years and years and years, which is, this is apartheid, we shouldn't be funding it. This is apartheid, we shouldn't be funding it. Like, let's keep pushing for that. And so I think that it's basically more weight and more heft behind the framework that many of us have been coming to for a while. Then there's also the reality of like, does that impact or change what our asks are of Congress? And I think the answer is no. I think the asks stay the same, like, but we just have more backing behind why we're asking for them, right? Like the asks stay the same. The asks are, like, if you read through the Amnesty International report, at the end, there's, like suggestions for what government should do. And among them are the things that our movement groups have been calling for Congress to do for a really long time, right? Like condition and withhold military funding in accordance with blah, 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 like make sure that you aren't being complicit in and supporting these things, use diplomatic pressure to, those are implement sanctions. Like those are things that we've been calling for. And now we just have a fresh kind of institutional backing behind what we've been saying. And I think that that's kind of some of the framework for how we keep pushing that moving forward, because it is so critical and important to name it, and also to keep it centered on, to not lose the conversation of like, what does that mean for people in the frame, right? So we're like, this is apartheid, but here's what that means for people. Like apartheid it's not just like, it's apartheid and we all understand what that means. Like it's apartheid. What that means is that a Palestinian child and Israeli child who basically live next to each other are subject to entirely different legal systems.
Right, but that point hasn't been made sufficiently explicit before. The fact that there are two legal systems, it may have been made before, but now it has everybody's attention because of the apartheid frame. And
I agree.
All these are, so
agree.
So I guess what I'm asking is whether, or to what extent, it's going to change. I mean, the facts on the ground haven't changed, but the willingness of people to understand them in a different frame, in an illegal frame, an illegal, unlawful frame, have changed. And so there's now an additional impetus to representing those facts on the ground in this frame. To me, it should make a difference to lawmakers who are in large part lawyers and deal with law. But maybe it won't work out that way. But you know, I wanted to get
No, I take your point. Yeah.
But so let's go to the electoral strategies, because you know, you've got a small number of candidates that you've endorsed. So I want you to give us some sense of sort of how you go about doing that, what kind of commitments you try to extract from candidates in order to get that endorsement, what kind of success or what kind of interest or disinterest have you had among progressives in getting that endorsement. And then I want to talk to you about the new effort that is obviously being made by the Israel lobby now, that is funneling and more explicitly, more openly, some millions of dollars now to fight the very people that you are trying to elect and re-elect in Congress. All right.
Funny how that happens. I think actually what I'll do is I'll answer both of those. I'll speak to both of those kind of questions in one. And then because I also want to make sure I know you want to hear from others with other questions as well. And I think that they're interconnected. And so, you know, yeah, so we have a group called JVP. JVP Action PAC is the group that officially makes the endorsements. And the endorsements so far are of some truly stellar candidates. Some of whom you may recognize their names. Some of the incumbents that we've endorsed at JVP Action PAC include Marie Newman, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Cori Bush, Betty McCollum. And then we've also endorsed some incredible challenger candidates, some of whom actually their primary has recently passed, and then some of whom have primaries that are coming up. And those include Howeida Araf, who I think a lot of folks on this call may even know personally, because she's a longtime activist in this movement, who's running in Michigan.
And a civil rights lawyer.
And a civil rights lawyer, of course, lest we forget. Brittany Ramos-Tabarros, who is running in New York 11. Stephanie Gallardo, who's running in Washington 9. Muad Herezi, who's running in Connecticut's 1st District. Amy Vilela, who recently, unfortunately, lost her primary in Nevada. And Shervin Azami, who recently took a huge chunk out of Brad Sherman's votes, but sadly did not make it through his primary in California. Those are all candidates who are committed to working toward conditioning our military funding to the Israeli government and eventually reducing it and using it as a tool of leverage in forcing and pressuring the Israeli government to end its human rights violations against Palestinians. They're candidates who are committed to defending and standing up for the rights of activists to engage in a super legitimate social justice tactic of boycotts, divestments, sanctions. They're candidates who are progressive on a range of issues, right? Like, we're looking for candidates who are not just going to be out there on Palestine. We're looking for candidates who are going to be out there for all of our justice, all safety and justice for all of us, and who understand that solidarity between groups is how we move forward and how we come to real safety in our lives and being able to live in true freedom eventually. And they're candidates who are up against incumbents, if they're challengers, up against incumbents who we think are worth challenging. Even if they don't win, are they up against incumbents who need to know that the progressives are coming for that seat and are not willing to just let them take this seat over and over and over again and do nothing about it? Are they representing areas where there's a lot of our people who are ready to get involved? Like I mentioned before, we see electoral organizing, we see congressional organizing and advocacy not as like the way we organize, right? Like I always say this, I don't think I'd want to work for a group that wasn't first and foremost a grassroots movement organization that engaged in a range of tactics. We are not like a electoral group that also has a base. We are a movement organization with a base that also does electoral organizing and congressional advocacy. And I think it's important that we right size that. Again, like these are specific tactics that have specific roles to play in a broader movement that it is engaging in like a beautiful range of different organizing strategies that get us moving in the right direction. And that also Congress sees, right? Like those of you who might be engaged in like building a Judaism beyond Zionism, or building a new Havurah or synagogue, or taking this to your church to talk to your church about boycott, like all of those things are critical tactics that are part of this broader movement ecosystem that we're in. And electoral organizing has to fit into that broader kind of thinking as well. I think that the point you're raising about AIPAC spending, DMFI PAC spending, all of these groups that are more deeply throwing down into like stopping progressives from running races and trying to like, for example, bump Rashida out of her seat. That's another example of that backlash that I talked about before. AIPAC has existed for decades without ever officially getting involved in elections. In reality, we know that they were getting involved in elections, but they were doing it kind of in other routes and ways and tactics. Whereas like now they're like, okay, we have AIPAC PAC, we exist, we are involved in elections in this way much more directly. There's a reason that they did that this cycle, and it's because they felt like they needed to. Like it's as simple as that. They wouldn't have done it if they didn't think they need to. It wasn't that one day they woke up and they were like, you know, it'd be great that we never thought about before. What if we launched a PAC? Like, no, they had considered it and weighed it and decided that they didn't need to. And then they considered it and weighed it again, and they decided, no, we need to now. And that's because this movement, our movement, is growing. And so these moments where we're like, is this even worth it? Is there any change really happening? Like, I get it. Like, I get it. I feel that way deeply a lot of the time because this change is so, ugh. I think it's important to remember that when these things happen that are losses in so many ways for us and losses for Palestinians and for this movement, they're also a sign that the opposition has felt a need to fight back harder. And they fight back harder because our movement is growing and gaining power. And so it's our job to not get tuckered out, to not be like, ugh, forget it. I'm gonna like, because the second we say forget it to Congress, we are ceding that space.
There's no question about that. And it's important to keep spirits up, but
keep spirits up,
also,
yeah.
It's also important to think about, and I'm sure you started to think about, what are you going to do to confront this new movement on the part of the lobby and the injection of these enormous funds? I mean, the impact has been...
The impact is overwhelming.
You can't, I mean, Summer Lee was up by 24 points in Pennsylvania 12. She won by a nose.
Undeniable impact, absolutely.
And we can go down, you know, from Nina Turner, Erica Smith,
Nida Alam,
Jessica Cisneros was up a substantial portion, and they just announced today, I think this morning, she lost her recount.
Yeah.
So, you know, what are you?
Yeah.
What are you thinking about? I mean, how much money are we raising in small donations?
Yeah. Well, so there's a few. Yeah, there's a few different things. I think that one is recognizing as true what you just said is like probably the most important thing, right? Like acceptance is the first step. Like none of us can be in denial here. Like this has an impact on elections. There's a tangible, concrete, devastating impact. And I think it's also important for us to like, I think that a lot of times in the Palestinian rights movement, we sometimes are like, we can like get really focused on the Palestinian rights movement as we should. But also I think this is a moment for us to like look up and look around and be like, what new allies did we just gain? Because AIPAC isn't just coming for the Palestinian rights movement right now. DMFI PAC isn't just coming for the Palestinian rights movement right now. NORPAC, all these groups, they are going after progressives who sometimes aren't even that vocal about Palestinian rights. But if they are a progressive, and especially if they're a progressive woman of color, who these groups believe will get to Congress and start supporting initiatives for Palestinian rights, they are going at them hard. And what that means is that the best thing that we in the movement can do is look up and think, who for the first time right now is asking themselves, what is AIPAC? What is DMFI? What are these groups? Like, who is involved in electoral organizing and is now feeling the weight of what it means to have anti-Palestinian groups coming at you? Like, that's a moment for us to reach out and be like, hey, hi, let's talk about this. Like, we've been dealing with AIPAC for decades. They are apartheid supporters. They've never supported democracy. It shouldn't be shocking that they're supporting insurgents just because those people also support apartheid. Like, let's talk about it. This is a bring in moment. This is a get new allies moment. That's like step one. That's how we grow our power, right? Because we have to grow. I've talked about growing. I know I've like every answer I've given. We as a movement need to all be base builders. I have a coworker who always talks about being at a protest and hearing someone say, everyone here is on outreach. Like, all of us have a job here, and it's outreach. Every time something like this happens, it's our job to look around and be like, who is thinking about this for the first time or in a new way? Let me talk to them. Let me bring them in. Let me organize them. Let me get them. That's how we grow. And when we grow, that comes with two things when it comes to the electoral world. One is it comes to more people knocking doors, more people phone banking. And that's part of how Summer Lee did win by a nose, right? But it also comes with more grassroots dollars. And we have to be real about that in the progressive movement. Is I think we have a little bit of an aversion to being like, we got to fundraise for these progressive candidates because we are all grassroots organizers. But the truth is, moving money, moving resources is also a key part of this. And we have to like be ready to like talk about that too and like lean into that more as well. So I think that it's a growth moment. It's a horrible moment, don't get me wrong. This is like scary, but it's also a moment for us to be like, who can we get right now? Who is really mad at AIPAC that wasn't thinking about AIPAC last year?
All right, that sounds like you're thinking of building or how to build a Palestinian lobby, a pro-Palestinian lobby, which it seems, is partially in place. You have a whole bunch of groups with which you collaborate, the U.S. campaign, IMEU. You have some press organs like Mondoweiss that are allies, but are you thinking about what a Palestinian lobby, a pro-Palestinian lobby would look like, and whether and to the extent to which you can make it intersectional, which is really what you're talking about, by appealing to other folks, other folks who might be, who might be suffering from the same backlash that you've described.
Mm-hmm. I'm not into like lobbying. I'm not into the term like the Palestine lobby, the Israel lobby. I think part of it is connected to kind of what I said before, which is that, I'm like, first and foremost, we need to like remember that we're part of a grassroots movement. We represent a grassroots movement. But I think what you said is true, which is like, like all of these groups that you just named and more that are advocating in Congress, we are the Palestine. That's what we are. Like, we are going to Congress. We are bringing our demands to Congress. We are never going to lobby the way that anti-Palestinian groups lobby. That's not our style. That's not how we do things. Our power comes from our people. That's where it comes from. And I think that like what you're describing, bringing these allies, like there's different language to describe these different things that happen in different ways. But like, we're talking about growing our movement, growing our base, bringing in new allies. And that's happening all the time. If you look at who is endorsing Betty McCollum's Palestinian Children and Families Act, that is a long list of organizations, many of whom do not work on Palestine, as it were. It's not one of their issue areas, but they were brought in, and now in their congressional advocacy work, they have endorsed this Palestinian rights legislation, and that comes with power. So that's like,
yeah, but remember, the AIPAC doesn't like the term Israel lobby either.
yeah,
but
sure.
they function as one, and they grew their movement to a huge extent with enormous resources and tremendous tentacles in the power bases in both parties. So you know, that's why I thought the question was worth pondering, and you can think about it after today. I want to ask, there are a couple of questions in the chat that I want to ask. One from Pat Miner, who asked, should we be encouraging candidates to make pro-Palestinian statements during the election cycle, or get them elected first?
What a great question. I think it's always good to have candidates who are speaking out for Palestinian rights. And I think that every candidate has their own context that they will think about, and they will make different decisions based on that context and based on what their calculation is of everything. But I think that it's important that candidates run and win while on being vocal for Palestinian rights, right? Like, and again, that it's, you know, like, I think it's also important that we remember that, like, there's not one answer to the question, how do you support Palestinian rights? Like, candidates will say that in many different ways. It can look like there are different things that it will look like, that different people will talk about different, but in general, like, the thing that is important is that we can say, like, this candidate who openly spoke about conditioning military funding to the Israeli government based on human rights violations against Palestinians won. Not this candidate who secretly supported that but didn't tell anyone they won, and then they did it when they got to Congress. Like, sure, yeah, okay, great, do it when you get to Congress. But to build that power, it's also important that we can show, like, you can run and win with this as part of your broader platform. So it's a good question though, Pat, and I think that there's a lot of context-specific things involved, but we want people being vocal on Palestinian rights.
But let me ask you a related question. You know, going back to the people that didn't vote no, you know, on the Iron Dome bill. Some of those people you're supporting, and some you're not.
Yeah.
Is Pocan? Are you supporting Pocan?
We haven't publicly. There's like conversations ongoing, and there's the rolling endorsements. Basically, is the cycle. So it's a rolling endorsement process.
And Jamal Bowman?
No, we're not endorsing Jamal Bowman.
Okay. Is there reason for that?
You know, Jamal Bowman, I think, has done a lot in Congress that has been really good for the Palestinian rights movement. And he's done a lot in Congress that has not been good for the Palestinian rights movement. And our role in our congressional advocacy is to, like, work and push constantly for more and more. But as it is now, he's not in a position where we're not able to endorse him based on where things currently stand. And I think it speaks to that point that you raised before, Bob, about, like, this is not a linear thing. This is a constant. We have to change the political calculus for everyone, and we have to be constantly pushing and pushing and pushing and demanding and demanding and demanding.
Right. And of course, who's running against him now is Catherine Parker, who recently announced and criticized him severely in her introductory email for not being strong enough on Israel. So, you know, these are tough issues as to who you're going to support.
And there's so many in the Democratic Party who are just like, it'll never be, like, they just like a love fest over there for sending military dollars over.
All right. So Tom Getman asks, there's a growing awareness that the end of occupied Palestine will come only when Israeli Jews say enough. Are we getting closer?
It's a really good question. My true answer is that I am not an Israeli Jew, and I don't think I can speak to the intricate details of how that's moving. I will say that if we look at the disillusion of the current Knesset, which was not, don't get me wrong, that coalition government was continuing the horrible apartheid regime. But if we look at that and the fact that we are now facing down a possible second, another Netanyahu win potentially, and an incredibly right-wing government as well, which again, when it comes to Palestine, every Israeli government has been right-wing and horrible. I don't think it indicates good things for how Israelis are voting and what they want to see and what they are supporting. So that's not my focus of the work, so I won't speak to it in too much more detail than that. But I will say that I don't think that that's the only thing that has to happen. I think that the truth is the US government is incredibly complicit in everything happening. And we are a huge funder of it, and we defend it at every turn in the international arena. And I think if we were to get to I think it's important for us as organizers to think about like, where is our locus of control? And in the US, our locus of control is around shifting US government on this. And that's what we should stay focused on. And if we can actually cut that support and shift and change that reality, that would have an incredibly huge impact on what the Israeli government can and does do. So I know that may not have actually been the full answer to what you wanted. Apologies, but
no. But I think the follow-up question is how do you see us getting there? What has to happen before the U.S. government essentially turns its back on Israel? What a good question. Because that's what withdrawing the funding is going to involve.
Yeah.
And is it any different than the decades it took before the United States government and the rest of the world withdrew its support of the Afrikaner apartheid?
Right. I mean, I think that, yeah, that's the question, right? And so I think that for me, the thing that it kind of goes back again, it's like a full circle conversation to the beginning of what we were talking about, of like the way that things don't move in a predictable slow motion. It's not like every year it moves this much closer to ending In reality, it's like nothing's happening. Whoa, a lot just moved. Okay, nothing's happening. And I think that our job, again, as organizers, as a movement that is always growing, is to ensure that we are speeding the timeline up as much as possible. So it's not that it's like, okay, it took us 50 years to get here, so it's going to take us 50 years to get another. That we can't wait that long. Palestinians can't wait that long. The reality is that there is an ongoing Nakba, an ongoing ethnic cleansing, and a violent apartheid regime happening now. But the more that we can push, and this also ties into what I was saying before about how like the way we shift US government policy is not just through congressional advocacy. It's not just through electoral organizing. We also do it via all the other types of organizing we are doing to shift and change the reality of what people in this country are wanting and demanding, to get to the point where it is just overwhelming that what Americans are demanding is that we don't want to send money to an apartheid regime. And Americans are going to demand it for different reasons, right? Like we want as many as possible doing it for the right reasons. And there are going to be some who are like, you know what, like this isn't the best use of our spend. Like we want it to get to the point where like we just have this overwhelming idea that this is the logical thing to do, that we are then getting more and more Democrats to support and making it, like growing that wedge and forcing it in that way. And I think that the other piece of this is like, there is a point where if we look like 5 years ago, people weren't talking about conditioning military funding in the way that they are right now to the Israeli government. It was like a couple people were talking about it in DC, but it was like not really a conversation in any real way. Now it's constantly being discussed. Like it is constantly being brought up and discussed and brought over and over and over and over again in a way that like actually moved in like one election cycle. It became kind of like a topic of conversation that now many progressive candidates have to wrestle with in a new way. That's not enough, conditioning military funding, and we're not doing it yet, so it's definitely not enough. But all that to say that like I think these things have to like will keep moving more and more quickly, the faster we grow the base of people in this country who are demanding it.
All right, there are only two more quick questions because I know time is running short. Speaking of South African apartheid, in November 1974, the General Assembly of the UN suspended South Africa from participating in its work due to international opposition to apartheid. Now, that was 20 years before apartheid ended. But it occurred to me when I saw that, why isn't working in the United Nations on the agenda, where there's no, and in the General Assembly, where there's no US veto?
Yeah.
It fits so well with the new apartheid frame. So I'm wondering, well, what about the notion of devoting some effort to lobbying countries in the General Assembly?
I think it is on the agenda and it should be on the agenda. The truth is that, like, if I'm speaking as JVP Action, every group just has like limited. We all have to make decisions around like where our resources and our capacity can be best used. If we were huge, we would probably have more people in different spaces, and as it is now, like, our focus of where we think we can best use our voice and our resources is in pushing, again, it's like, where is our locus of control as for JVP and JVP Action, an American Jewish organization? It's in organizing and advocating in these specific ways. But there are tons of other groups that are doing really important pushes at the UN, and I think it should continue to be a focus.
All right. You just made a good argument as to why we need to radically expand Jewish Voice for Peace and JVP Action.
Well, and lots of other Palestinian rights groups in this country.
Yeah.
It needs a lot more resources, yeah.
All right, so Phil Weiss had a question. How do you distinguish between AIPAC and J Street, and is J Street an ally?
Great question. Well, we don't work with J Street on the Hill, really. Our orgs don't really overlap on initiatives, and in fact, there's often kind of like countering initiatives. And J Street and AIPAC are different in what they're lobbying for. I think that, the way I often think about it is like, AIPAC is endorsing and supporting like the worst, most extreme, hawkish possible views you can take on this issue. And J Street is taking an anti-occupation stance, right? Like this is kind of, J Street represents liberal Zionist views, and that's not a radical thing to say. That's what they represent. And so they represent a position of opposing occupation, and they are centering a push for a two-state solution, which again is actually different than AIPAC and definitely different than JVP Action. And I think one of the biggest differences in like the push for a two-state solution in Congress versus what I would say that like JVP Action and other Palestinian solidarity groups are pushing for is that, like, when I am talking to members of Congress, often what I'm saying is like, you know what? Like, you shouldn't be dictating what the political solution is. Like, it's not your role as a US politician to say how many states should come out of this situation, right? Like, who are we to say that? Who are we? Honestly, who am I as an American Jew to say, like, it's not, and Congress, it's definitely not their role to be like, two-state solution, that's what you got to do. Congress controls the purse strings. That's their job. The House of Representatives like is controlling the purse strings of the US government budget. And so what we are often coming to them and saying is like, your job is to make sure that we aren't paying for apartheid and that we aren't paying for these ongoing systematic human rights violations and war crimes that we are currently paying for and funding. And I think that that's a different centering than those other groups take, for sure. And so it is often different then in like how it plays out on the Hill. And then separate from that, but a thought that's worth saying is that I think for those of us who are first and foremost rooted in this grassroots movement, it can be shocking to show up in DC and see how far behind the conversation is. It really is really far behind. Like, there's so many members of Congress who won't say occupation. It is so twisted over there. It's so twisted. And so, like, I think it just speaks again to the fact that, like, it is our job. Everyone's on outreach. Everyone's on outreach. It's our job to grow. Like, that is what we as a movement, in solidarity and following the lead, like this Palestinian rights movement, all of us, bring people in, bring people in, bring people in, because that is how we get to push and push and push Congress on what we need to be pushing them on, which is not a two-state solution, certainly not what AIPAC and everyone is pushing for. It's stop funding this apartheid, stop funding this ethnic cleansing. And since we're running on time and I know we're wrapping, I want to end on, not that DC is twisted, which it is, but I want to end on the point that, like, many of you on this call have been doing this work for like decades. Some of you have been doing it for shorter. I've been doing it for about a decade, a little over a decade. In terms of what we have gotten from Congress and how we are moving in Congress, we are further right now than I thought we were going to be 5 years ago. That's the truth. And we are gaining more quickly than I thought we would. And I think that what is true is that we are growing faster and faster and faster. And it is like, we will keep pushing and moving in that correct direction. And I think it's good for us to remember and feel, even in the moments where we're like, okay, we're being attacked, this movement is under attack, to remember, like, the other side is freaking out, and that's why this backlash is coming in this way. And it's a moment for us to double down and not get tired. So I think I'll try to leave it on that note.
Beth Miller, that is a great note to end on.